My son Christian and I had an interesting conversation with our special guest speaker, Steve Miller, a couple of weeks ago. Steve, as you may remember, holds 5 world records as a strongman and is featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not for standing on a platform 27 stories high and holding a 150-pound bungee jumper, as she jumps, he's holding her by the cords just in his hand. Check this out.
Las Vegas Strip. And what you are about to witness is truly unbelievable. Kelly Akers is going to bungee jump while Stephen Miller holds the cord with his bare hands. Now, this event is so dangerous that we had to close this area off to the public. Now, you guys have to be nervous about this, are you?
A little bit, yes.
Kelly, you've got to be a little bit nervous. You're putting your life in this man's hands.
I'm more nervous about the wind.
About the wind. There's a lot of risk involved here. Can you explain a little bit about what's going to happen?
Well, she'll jump, and, combining her body weight with the weight of the cord and the G-forces that it, creates, it's going to create quite an incredible pull that I've got to hold with my bare hands.
Exactly. What did you have to do to prepare for this?
I just train pretty intensely all the time anyway, but God has really blessed me with a real unique gift of strength in my arms and my hands, so I'm going to use that tonight.
Even the wind is clocking in at 37 miles per hour. Are you confident you can do this?
Yeah, I'm ready.
You okay, Kelly? All right.
Nick, you set? All right, here we go. On 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
My gosh. Oh, Stephen. Stephen, you did it.
Still doing it.
Now, that girl, by the way, who's the only girl I've ever known who's willing to share her weight, but that's another point. That girl had only bungee jumped once. Steve made her go try it once before this feat. Now, again, he holds crazy world records for doing seemingly impossible feats of strength, and we asked him if he practices these feats before he does them, and he said no. He never practices a feat before he does it, and the reason why is because he usually does something so physically taxing that it breaks a number of bones in his hands and it rips muscles in his bodies, so he can't actually practice the feat. He just tries to be as strong as he can be, and so on. And then the next question I think Christian asked him was, then how do you know that you can do it? And his answer was simple and profound. He said that he knows he can do it when he can see himself doing it in his mind. He knows he can do it when he can see himself doing it in his mind. I was reminded of that passage in the New Testament where Paul prayed for the Ephesians, and he said, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead. Now, it's one thing to be able to see something in your mind that you believe you can do. It's another thing to be able to see something with the eyes of your heart that you believe God can do, some impossible thing in your life. So last week we began a series called Great 7 Steps to the Miraculous. We talked about how a miracle is a reversal of the natural order of things. A miracle in the New Testament is, by its very etymology, an explosion of almightiness. A miracle is when God does something great in us or through us that is beyond what could be done by normal human agency. Now, what Steve Miller has done are feats of amazing human strength. But a miracle is more than that. A miracle is a feat of supernatural strength that flows from God's incomparably great power when we believe. Today, I'm praying that God opens the eyes of our hearts to see what God can do through His power in our lives. This is so important. We must be able to see the apparently impossible become possible with the eyes of our heart. We need to see it in alignment with God's promises. And as we'll discuss today, we need to be able to say what we see. Now, we need to see this, but not like the guy I heard about recently who on a Friday left work, went to hang out with the guys, ended up not showing up back at home without telling his wife until late Sunday night. And he shows up, he spent his paycheck, she is furious, she harangues him for an hour, and then finally she just stops in utter frustration and she says, "How would you feel if you didn't see me for 3 days?" And he said, "Well, that would be fine with me." And he didn't see her Monday, and he didn't see her Tuesday, and he didn't see her Wednesday. But early Thursday morning, the swelling went down just enough that he could barely see her out of his right eye. I'm not talking about barely seeing what we believe God says that He can do in our lives. I'm talking about opening our eyes wide to see the impossible becoming possible in our lives. Now, these 7 steps to the miraculous, which I'm going to talk about for about the next 40 minutes, these 7 steps to the miraculous came to me as I was reading through a section in the Old Testament called Ezra-Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah tells the story about how in 539 BC, the Jewish people experienced a miraculous return from, at that point, 50 years of exile back from Babylon to Jerusalem. I talked at some length last week about all the history around that. I won't do that again this week. But Ezra and Nehemiah is the story of miracle after miracle that allowed the people to return to Jerusalem, the temple which had been torn down to be rebuilt, for God's covenant with His people to be renewed, and for the city of Jerusalem, which was in utter disrepair, and the wall around it, which had been torn down, its gates burned by fire, to be rebuilt as well. All of this happened. Ezra and Nehemiah covers a period of about 100 years. The first step for the miraculous that I extracted from this miracle story last week was prayer. We said that step 1 to experience the miraculous is to pray for the miraculous. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time today around the second step. And it's quite simple, and you have already seen it on the screen behind me. Step 2 is to announce for the miraculous. Announce for the miraculous. Last week we discussed how Nehemiah, a trusted Jewish advisor in the court of the Persian Emperor Artaxerxes I, received news from Jerusalem that although the temple in this miracle story had already been rebuilt, the city was still in ruins and the wall was in disrepair. This was about 94 years after the return that we're told about as beginning in the first chapter of Ezra. Now I'm talking from the first chapter of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, hearing this old news that the wall had been torn down, is about 94 years after the return had begun and about 74 years after the temple had been rebuilt and dedicated. For some reason, as we discussed last week, Nehemiah's heart was stirred with this old news that the wall surrounding Jerusalem had never been rebuilt since its destruction some 142 years earlier. And Nehemiah began to mourn and fast and pray. Then he prayerfully sought the blessing of the emperor to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and rebuild the wall. A miracle ensued. Artaxerxes said yes, and he exerted his power to help Nehemiah return and rebuild this wall that had been utterly destroyed for again, 142 years. Now, a careful reading of Ezra preceding Nehemiah lets us know that Artaxerxes, the Persian emperor, had stopped an earlier attempt to really rebuild the city. So when Nehemiah went before him and asked him if he could go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall after having prayed, he actually changed the mind of the most powerful man in the world. And he did this through prayer. Nehemiah, through prayer, received direction as to what he was to do. Nehemiah, before he spoke to Artaxerxes, he actually prayed before Artaxerxes, perhaps in his mind or under his breath, but he prayed as he asked Artaxerxes for this thing that happened that was a miracle in itself and resulted in the miracle of the wall being rebuilt. After Nehemiah prayed and received this permission from Artaxerxes, he went to Jerusalem. Again, this is an 800-mile journey. Artaxerxes provided troops to protect him on his way and financing and so on and so forth. This is what happened when Nehemiah got to Jerusalem. Nehemiah 2, verse 11. He wrote, "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem." I emphasize that part. At this point, as it concerned the people in Jerusalem, Nehemiah had not told them what God had put in his heart. He said, "By night I went out through the valley gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate." I edited this a little bit. Nehemiah goes almost all the way around Jerusalem, surveying the wall and seeing the condition it was in. Then he wrote, "I went back into the city. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing because, as of yet, I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them," so to this point it's just been in his own heart, the heart of a few trusted confidants. Artaxerxes knows. But now he says to the people who are going to be impacted by this thing he has in his heart, he says to them, or I would say it this way, he announced to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. Now again, this is the beginning of yet another miracle in this miraculous story. This wall ended up being rebuilt, most scholars believe, in about 50 days. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Nehemiah credited God's miraculous power when this feat of supernatural strength ended up being accomplished. So just to recap, after he prayed at length, Nehemiah then announced what God had put in his heart to do. First, he announced it to Artaxerxes. He sought the confirmation and blessing of the authority over his life. And then he didn't announce it to anyone else for some time, not until he'd arrived in Jerusalem and conducted a feasibility of sorts. Then he announced to the stakeholders involved what God had put in his heart to do, and he called them to action. At some point, we must announce the great thing or things we see in our heart and are believing God for. When we come to that place, when we can see it with the eyes of our heart, we must understand that there's a time when it's not enough to see it, but we also must say it. There's an important spiritual principle here. It's not enough to just have something in our heart. Paul wrote to the Romans about a bigger idea than this, but the principle is shown nonetheless. He wrote to the Romans in Romans 10, verse 10, "It is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved." Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them." Do you see the principle? We see it with our heart. We believe it. But at some point, we have to step out and say it. I challenge each of us to say what we believe for. It's easy, if you please, to just have it in your heart. But there's risk and vulnerability involved in saying what you see. Do something. Put a God-inspired vision board on your wall, and don't waste your vision effort on silly things, but make an announcement to yourself and others. This is the great thing, the miraculous thing that I believe God wants to do in my life. This great thing doesn't need to be great in comparison to some other thing someone else has done. It's just the thing God's put in your heart that's in alignment with His calling on your life, that's in alignment with His gifts that He's given you, and alignment with your passions. It's great in relationship to who you are, who God made you, and God's dreams for your life. But at some point, you have to say it. So many years ago, and by the way, I'll just stop and ask, everybody doing okay? All right. You're awful quiet. You're probably awful quiet because I'm awful loud. I don't know. Many years ago, most of you in this room are very familiar with this. Many years ago, Jim Collins introduced the acronym BHAG to the world. And it's become a part of normal corporate vernacular. BHAG. Everybody knows what a BHAG is. A BHAG is a big, hairy, audacious goal, right? Collins said, all companies have goals, but there's a difference between merely having a goal and becoming committed to a huge, daunting challenge. An example that he uses, and a great example, is John F. Kennedy in 1961 galvanizing the attention of the United States around the goal to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely to the earth. That doesn't seem like that big of a deal for us now. However, when he said it, the best science, the most optimistic science said that there was probably a 50-50 chance of that actually happening. It was a big, hairy, audacious goal. But he captured the attention of the American people. Congress allotted billions of dollars towards that effort. And of course, a few years later, we were successful after, sadly, John F. Kennedy was gone. Jim Collins says this further. He said, a true BHAG is clear and compelling and serves as a unifying point of effort. It has a clear finish line. A BHAG engages people. It reaches out and grabs them in the gut. It is tangible, energizing, and highly focused. One thing that I like about this whole BHAG thing is that it forces you, when you announce it, it forces you to go all in. You see something with the eyes of your heart, okay, but then you announce it. You say, this is what I believe for. It forces, again, a certain vulnerability. You have to be all in. And sometimes, frankly, and I'm a relatively bold person, but I'll tell you, frankly, that sometimes I'd rather just announce a BG, a big goal, or maybe a BHG, a big hairy goal, which is what I did when I announced that I was using Rogaine years ago. Oh, that has nothing to do with this. But a big, hairy, audacious goal, when you put yourself out there and you say, this is what I see, well, It can be a frightening thing. But then I feel, and I've felt over the years, God pushing me even beyond this, really far beyond that. Beyond big and hairy and audacious, I feel God pushing me to a BMAG. Now, this is a new term that we're coining today. A BMAG, as opposed to a BHAG, is a big, miraculous, audacious goal. A goal that's beyond what I know I can accomplish in my own power. A goal that is so crazy that if God doesn't do something supernatural, it simply will not be done. Now, I'm going to step out today, and I'm going to model this. I'm going to announce a BMAG. And I'm going to do this because, first of all, again, I want to model it. Secondly, as the lead pastor of the Life Christian Church, I want to announce the BMAG that I hope will galvanize the energies of our congregation to what I believe God has called us to do over the next many years. And thirdly, I want to launch a new era of destiny fulfillment at the Life Christian Church. There's been something very significant going on in my heart, and the people on our staff team are aware of this. Our board of deacons and pastors advisory council are aware of this. Some people who've been working with me around strategic planning are aware of this. But it's time to announce something that I think is very important. Part of the significance is that for the past 13 years, a lot of the energies of this church, even though we haven't necessarily publicly talked about it all the time, though we certainly have a lot, has been around developing this campus, which was an absolute BMAG for us, right? If you're unfamiliar with where we came from, the building that we moved from to this building is at 106 Harrison Avenue here in West Orange, a storefront, larger inside than it looks like, but an old bowling alley that had become a printing factory, and you'll see that it's contiguous with the liquor lobby on one side and Paulie's Pub on the other side. We had a lot of easy business there. But that's where we moved from. If you can imagine, if you were able to go back, let's say 13 years ago, and I stood up and said, we're going to move from there to here, it would have seemed pretty crazy, wouldn't it have? And for some 13 years, we've been building this building not to have a building, but to have a platform from which to spread God's love in ever-widening circles. Something very significant happened in me spiritually last week when we dedicated our new prayer center, which was the final piece of this whole project. We've not been talking about the project much for the last year because we didn't ask you directly for the funds to pay for finishing the third floor. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I will simply say to you that it has been a huge energy, resource, attention drain in a positive way, but a drain nonetheless for the past 13 years, and we can stand here this week for the first time ever and say, we are finished. That era is over. Praise God. But it's time for a new era to begin. And I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes, again, to model the BMAG to you. I'll end up bringing this back to you. But let me kind of act like a pastor for a few minutes and talk about what I believe God's calling us to. But I'll start with the brief outlines of a story that I wish I had more time to tell and had planned to tell, but I figured my sermon probably already is going to be longer than I want it to be. So I'll just give this to you in brief. Many of you have heard me say, and I've written about it in my last book, that in my late teenage years and into my early 20s, even before I had ever come to New York City initially, I knew that I was called to pastor a church in a suburb of New York City. Many of you have heard me say that. I started again, late teenage years, I started a file with ideas, organizational structure, outlines as to what I envisioned this church to look like. Then in my mid-20s, and by that time I'd been to this area several times, in my mid-20s I had a very dramatic spiritual experience where I felt tremendously convicted by my outsized ego and ambition. And I had a dramatic prayer experience where I was laying face down on the floor in a darkened room with such tremendous conviction about, why did I want to do what I wanted to do and had been saying I would do. By the way, when someone would ask me in my late teenage years, early 20s, what are you going to do? I would say, I'm going to build a church in a suburb of New York City and I would announce a certain number of people, which I've never, ever said since that experience in that room, where I stood up and went to this file that I had of this church I was going to build in a suburb of New York City, and I threw it away. And I said, Lord, I'm concerned that I want to do this because I just have a big ego. And I'm sorry for the way I've been, saying what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. And I'm not going to say it again until somehow I know that that's what you want me to do, and at least as much as my motives can be somewhat clean, pure, which I'm not going to say that, we're all human, right? And we're always dealing with a mix of those things. But until I have a sense that it's you. And until then, I'm going to forget this New York City dream, and I threw it in the trash. And for the next number of years, 5 or 6 years, when someone would say to me, what are you going to do? I would say, I don't know. Whatever I think the Lord's leading me to do, that's what I'm going to do. And, right now I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and I won't get into what that was. Just traveling around the country and preaching and doing crusades and stuff. I'm just going to keep doing this. Until one day, again, there's a long story around this, but here's the short version. I was driving in my car, this was 5 or 6 years later, and I put into I listened to a talk in my car from someone who was an early leader in the church growth movement in the United States. We're going back now 26 years. And this guy starts talking about a new way of thinking about church that sounded like he'd pulled that file out of that trash can and read my notes. Now, his thoughts were much further advanced than mine, but nonetheless, that's what it. And I'm listening to this guy talk, and I begin to cry, which especially at that age, I didn't do very often. And I had an experience as powerful as the experience I'd had 5 or 6 years ago. Now, this kind of thing doesn't happen to me every day. Notice, we're talking about a 5 or 6 year period between these really dramatic experiences. I had an experience similar to that one where I felt that dream God had given me for a church in a suburb of New York City resurrected in me. It was incredible. I got out of the car, I walked through the door of our home, and Sharon said, Terry, you have a call from West Orange, New Jersey. And it was the call inviting me to consider coming here to accept the pastorate of this church. And, I did. And the rest is history. In case you didn't notice, this is drum roll time. We're sitting here in West Orange, New Jersey, in a suburb of New York City. But there's one part of that story that I haven't told publicly ever. And rarely have I ever said anything about this except in telling that story about throwing that file away. So we're going back 30 plus years before I've talked about what I'm about to talk about now. The vision that I had, now this is the BMAG, you ready? The vision that I had as a teenager was to build a church in a suburb of New York City of 10,000 people. I've never felt comfortable saying that. I have never felt comfortable, if you've been around here for a long time, setting numerical goals. I don't think that we've ever set numerical goals because I threw that away all those years ago as a young guy. But a week or so after we moved here to 747 down to the first floor, so we're going back 4 years now, I was praying one day and I felt this 10,000 thing come rushing into my heart again, and I could see it. I didn't say anything to anybody about it. A week or so later, we had a guest speaker. He's been here one time. He was an old friend. I was thinking about hiring him for a staff position. It was a slow Sunday. I asked him to speak. He got up in the pulpit and he said, "Hey, you know the memory I have of Terry Smith? I remember Terry Smith being a really young guy, and he was speaking at our church in San Jose, California, and he sat in my office, and I said, 'Terry, what are you going to do with your life?' And Terry said, 'I'm going to go to New York City, I'm going to go to a suburb of New York City, and I'm going to build a church of 10,000 people.'" And I'm thinking, I didn't ever remember having that conversation with him. But here he says it out loud. And for the last 4 years, I've been not talking about it until just recently, thinking about this, praying about this, checking my heart about this, which I can't tell you that I have a perfect or pure heart. I'm not going to ever say that to you. But as much as I can, checking my heart about this, and then here in a strat ops, a 5 to 10 year plan thing that we were doing, a day-long retreat here a couple months ago, and the person leading it said, "Pastor, you need to talk to us. What is your vision for this church?" I knew at that moment I had to announce what I believed I saw in my heart, and I did. And then I did to our executive and creative and pastoral teams as we prepared for this city. And then I sought the blessing of the Board of Deacons and the Pastor's Advisory Council. And I'm standing here today to tell you what I believe, and frankly, I feel really weird and vulnerable. But I have to announce to you what I believe God has put in my heart for the next season here at the Life Christian Church. Now, there are a lot of elements to it, which we will unpack in a variety of ways over the coming weeks and months. I'm not going to get into details today, but here is the BMAG. This is how we've decided to say this. TLCC times 5 equals 10K plus by 2025. Thank you, Bob Stolte. You didn't realize that I actually did steal what you said to me that day. TLCC times 5 equals 10K plus by 2025. We believe that by the end of 2025, we will have, note this term, an audience of 10,000 or more people, and that we will continue to believe for and work toward a congregation of 10,000 people by 2028 or 10,000 years from now. When I say an audience, that's going to be a very broad term. I'm saying that sometime in 2025, we want to have not a membership, not even a congregation, but an audience of 10,000 people. We want 10,000 people to hear us share the good news. Maybe that's an Easter weekend or a Christmas season or a whatever, but we're going to work towards that over the next 7 or 8 years, depending on how you count. When we say TLCC times 5, we mean that in 2 ways. First of all, 5 times our Easter average attendance of the past 2 years. So, since we moved into this new auditorium, We've been here 2 years now for Easter. I had somebody go add up our attendance for Easter weekend, divide it by 2. This is kind of amazing that our average attendance on Easter the last 2 years was 2,747. All right? 2,747. We're going to believe God in the next 7 to 8 years for 5 times or something close. That's actually 13,000. But I can see in my heart in 7 years having an attendance, an audience in 2025 of 10,000 or more people. And secondly, and this is the really big thing, by 2025, we want to have launched 4 new campuses, meaning that we will have 5 campuses, meaning TLCC times 5 will equal what we're believing God for. So we want over the next 7 to 8 years to launch 4 new campuses, beginning with the first launch of a multi-site campus by next Easter. And so we've been working towards this, talking towards this. You know, it's something that we attempted to do, and what we attempted to do became a church plant and so on. But we've been working again towards really developing a multi-site campus strategy that, again, we'll talk about in coming years. It kind of seems crazy, I think. We have a lot of empty chairs in this room to fill already. By the way, I had them put 80 more chairs, all of our chairs in the room last Sunday, because we're going to need these seats, and we might as well get them in the room, and let's start filling them up. And we want to launch churches in other communities that are TLCC. They're TLCC, who we are, launched in other communities that need a church like ours. Again, this past week I was battling doubt about this, announcing this. Not doubt about this, but about standing up here and saying it. And Wednesday's my sermon study day. And I work on it until Thursday afternoon. And I sat down in my devotional time and I read the next chapter in my normal devotions, which was the 144th Psalm. And this is what, as I was praying and thinking, am I really going to stand up and say this? And this is the Psalm that I read that morning, Psalm 144:9. I will sing a new song to you, my God, to the one who gives victory. Then our sons in their youth will be like well-nurtured plants, and our daughters will be like pillars carved to adorn a palace. Our barns will be filled with every kind of provision. Our sheep will increase by thousands, by tens of thousands in our fields. And over the years, as I've sensed the Lord speaking to me about things, He confirms it to me in all kinds of ways. I believe that our sheep are going to increase by thousands, by tens of thousands in our fields. Now, I'm going to go ahead and warn you that I'm going to take a few more minutes than I normally do, about 10 more minutes, to say a few more things about this and bring this back to your life, okay? 3 TLCC Big Mag perspectives, and I'll try to talk quickly. First of all, 1, we should want to reach many more people with the good news about Jesus. Look, we should want to reach many more people with the good news about Jesus. We've said that our mission emphasis this year is to expand, multiply, and gain a bigger audience for God. We've said that based on the work of the greatest theologian, philosopher in American history, Jonathan Edwards, who said that the reason God created the world was to expand Himself and multiply Himself so He could gain a bigger audience for Himself. We believe that we, as a part of what God's doing in the world, need to be expanding who we are, meaning getting better at what we presently do here. We need to be multiplying who we are to other communities that need us, and we need to be gaining a bigger audience for God. He wants to share Himself with more people, not less people. When you look at the story of the early church, it's a story of dynamic growth. They weren't afraid to talk about how they were growing. Acts 2:41, those who believed what Peter said were baptized and added to the church, about 3,000 in all. Acts 4:4, but many of the people who heard their message believed it, so that the number of believers totaled about 5,000. Acts 9:31, the church grew in strength and numbers. Acts 9:42, the news raced through the whole town, and many believed in the Lord. Acts 12:24, God's good news was spreading rapidly, and there were many new believers. Acts 13:49, so the Lord's message spread throughout that region. Acts 19:20, so the message about the Lord spread widely and had a powerful effect. Acts 6:7, our theme verse at TLCC, God's message was preached in ever-widening circles. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. We cannot be satisfied as long as anybody in our sphere of influence is far from God. Here's the second thing I'll say. It's that older and younger generations get to write this miracle story together. I want to spend time on this, so I'll probably bring this up at some point in the future. In Ezra chapter 3, when Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, was rebuilding the temple of Solomon that had fallen down, there's an interesting thing that happened. It said, Ezra 3:10, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests and the Levites took their places to praise the Lord. All they'd done is lay the foundation, but they took time to celebrate it. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. They lay the foundation of this new temple. The previous temple had been destroyed 50 years before. There was an older generation who had seen the previous temple, and when they saw the foundation of this new temple, they wept. The younger generations, which hadn't seen the previous temple, shouted for joy. But there was such a mix of shouting and crying that from a distance you couldn't tell whether the multitude was happy or sad. This passage made me think of those of us who've been around TLCC for a while. Those of us who've witnessed the miracles of the past and who've partnered with God to write the TLCC story to this point. The veterans, if you please, who have sacrificed and given and believed and accomplished, all of us together, something really amazing, a number of amazing things, miraculous things over the years. Here I stand today announcing that everything we've done to this point, and I feel this strongly, is only foundational. And I'm asking you, the veterans, the older generation, and I'm not necessarily talking age, I'm talking those of us who have been there, done that. I'm asking you to join me again in another God adventure. Don't cry, if you please, as you hear me stand up here and say, guys, we're not done, we're just getting started. I'm going to ask you to believe again. I'm going to ask you to risk again. I'm going to ask you to sacrifice again. I'm going to ask you to lead those newer generations of TLCC people to the preferred future that God has called us to. And I need you. I need you. I challenge those of you who stood by my side for so many years. Let's do this again. And then to the newer or younger generations. And by that I mean the people who are here in 20s or 30s who are starting to step up in leadership in amazing ways. But I'm also talking about those who are new to TLCC. Those of you who haven't been here, on this journey from where we were to where we are, from who we were to who we are now. Those of you who weren't here, I've heard some of you hear us tell our miracle stories. And I actually heard someone a few weeks ago say, I want to be a part of something like that. Well, we're going to give you an opportunity to be a part of something like that in coming years. And I have this vision in my mind as I'm standing here as a 54-year-old man, 10 to 15 years from stepping off the stage as the lead pastor of the Life Christian Church. 15 to 20 years, 30, I don't know, whatever. No, I'll step off when it's time to step off. I'm a long way from it, but I can see that out somewhere now. As I stand here, I have this amazing vision in my mind that for this next 10 to 15 years, my generation is going to get to lead this church. The older generation is going to get to lead this church with the younger generation sitting at the table with us and leading it along with us until we put it in their hands. Very few churches get to experience a genuine multi-generational leadership. We are going to enter, and we've already entered, an amazing season when you look at some of the leaders who are being raised up in our church, Christian and Amanda and Russ and on and on and on and on. You just say, wow, how did this happen? And it's not just those in the 20s and 30s, it's our teenagers who 10 years from now are going to be sitting at the board table in the boardroom making decisions about the future of this church. The older generation and the younger generation all need to rejoice together at the future God's called us to. And thirdly and finally, we're launching a new era now. And one way we're going to do this is to provide an opportunity, kind of a first step, a step of faith, is we're going to provide an opportunity for each of us to act in faith, to give in a one-day miracle offering, to provide the seed funding that we need to launch this new era. In 2004, and I didn't think about all of this, a lot of the things that I come up with, that seems to be so like, well, this connects to that and this connects to that. A lot of that stuff I just tell you guys. I couldn't teach you how to do that because it feels like I bumble my way into it a lot of times, and I'm planning something and I say, oh, wait, look how it's I need God to really help me with stuff, right? And this is one of those things that we talked about doing a miracle offering. We've been talking about this since last fall, okay? We've been talking about this since last fall. And just a few weeks ago, I realized only one time in our history have we done a one-day offering that we called a miracle offering. It was in 2004 when I challenged the church to this. And I said, right now, guys, we don't have enough money to even pay an architect to come in and to do a master site design to tell us what this will even cost us. We need to raise money for that and to hire some experts. We need $100,000. In a few weeks, we're going to do a $100,000 miracle offering in one day. It seemed impossible. Sure enough, that group of people, many of you are here in this room, gave $100,000. Most of it came in on one day. Some of it came in a few weeks later. $100,000 as seed money towards this. Here we are 13 years later, a congregation 4 times, almost exactly 4 times the size of that congregation. We're launching a new era, the era that will define, I think, the rest of my tenure here as lead pastor. And I'm going to ask us to step up and to do what that generation did 13 years ago and to give a one-day miracle offering of $400,000 that will seed the launch of our first multi-site, an expansion of our Plus Life Local and Plus Life Global efforts to spread God's love in ever-widening circles, and thirdly, to make a necessary payment against our indebtedness we're required to make at the end of this year. That's a significant payment, but that will free up all kinds of monies for us to do the things that we do here better next year without that being one of our responsibilities, to do K-Port better and Red Line better and all of that, and we'll explain some of this more. I'm not going to preach about this every week like this. I'm not going to do that. But we will find ways to communicate to you in more detail about what we're talking about. And I'm just putting that out there as something you can think and pray about. This miracle offering is going to be on November 5th, the first Sunday of November. Don't now in your mind say, well, that's a day I'm not coming. You're not going to want to miss it. We have a legend who's going to speak to us that day. We'll talk more about him as well, as you don't know him, in Tommy Barnett, the father of Luke Barnett and Matthew Barnett. It's amazing that we were able to have him here at TLCC, and that's going to be a truly historic day here in the history of the Life Christian Church. Now let me bring this full circle. So I'm going to challenge you now, this week, to think and pray about your BMAG. What do you believe God's put in your heart that you can see, but you're afraid to go out on a limb and say, this is what I know God's called me to do, because you're afraid as to what people will say. You're afraid how the people around you will respond. You're afraid people will say, well, look at her ego or his ego. You're afraid about those things. What do you believe God's called you to do? What's an appropriate way that you can stand up this week? And say to, maybe it's not this week, but maybe you start planning it this week. Whatever, you get my point. You figure out how to apply it right to your own life. But you start giving serious thought to this 7-step to the miraculous, where you've started to pray, and as you pray, you have direction. The eyes of your heart are seeing something possible that seemed impossible, and now it's time to step out and say it. I challenge you this week to figure out a way. Again, maybe because you're leading a large organization, maybe you shouldn't say it for 6 months until you have all kinds of meetings around things. That's fine. But resolve that you're going to figure out a way to announce it. And it could be a family goal, a personal goal, a business goal, a ministry goal. Next week, by God's grace, we'll pick this up with step 3, which I wish I could do that whole sermon right now because I'm so excited about it, even though I haven't written it and don't know exactly what I'd say. I'm still excited about it. Would you please stand with me?